Hi, Ravi.
Hi.
Hi. Firstly, I have to say I have read the book, guys. Yes. So
What does this mean?
this means I'm trying to be cool, but I'm not.
You are.
Always, yeah.
You
Yes.
definitely are. I'm the cool one who doesn't know what it means.
So,
The uncool one.
uh,
Sorry.
but on the onset, I want to say that I'm glad that I read the book because I'm not a book person, and I'm one of those people who consume most of the information from videos. And I'm so glad that you wrote a book that brought out nuances of what is happening in rural India or tier two cities or in India in general, which is and brought out so so without judgment. Like it's so informative and so useful. So before we start, I just wanted to understand that you mentioned that we are a bunch of 2%ers, right?
Yeah.
And what what motivated you, or what was your objective to bring out something which is happening in India, okay, across India, for for us who are typically like who living lives away from that what is happening in that part of the country.
Yeah. Um, so, one of the reasons why I wrote the book is when I first moved back to India in 2014. So I grew up mostly in India and I left in 2001, as I described, which was the beginning of the cell phone revolution, but not the smartphone internet revolution. And then when I was 14, right before the elections, as a journalist, um, I'll never forget this. It was the first night that I was in New Delhi. I was in a hotel room. I switched on the TV and I saw an ad. And many of you will know this ad. It's by Idea Cellular, and it was part of their campaign called the No Ullu Banawing campaign
Yeah.
of ads. And this particular one had a politician who was making tall promises. He was saying that, I'll give you 24 hours of electricity, I'll give you water, I'll give you roads and bridges, and making tall promises. And the villagers are nodding very sort of obediently. And then the shot cuts to these two guys who are sitting on a fence, and one of them pulls out his phone and he Googles the guy. And he realizes that, I mean, this politician made the same promises 5 years ago. And so he calls him out. He's like, hey, Mantri ji, हम लोग को उल्लू समझ के रखे हैं, ये सब तो 5 साल पहले promise किए आप लोग. And then they start throwing shoes at the politician, and the jingle breaks out, no ullu banawing. And it got me thinking because, you know, in America, for example, one doesn't see the smartphone or the internet as a leveler because there's not much leveling to be done in terms of technology, at least. It is a level playing field in terms of tech. Um, and in India, it seemed to me that wherever I went, sponsorships of cricket matches, the cricket team, the chaiwala, the boardings, the hoardings, everything was an internet company or a phone company sponsorship or advertisement. And it made me realize that there's a lot of propaganda behind this, that Indians are being sold this hope, this dream, that here is a device and here is a thing that is going to fix your lives. It's going to, whether you're a villager, whether you're illiterate, whether you're English speaker or Hindi speaker, or, rich or poor, male or female, this is going to equalize things, upper caste, lower caste. And for those of you who've seen all of those idea ads, they played on these tropes very well. And I realized I needed to explore this. Is this true? Is this really transformative? Is it going to be good transformation? Is it going to be bad transformation? And I set out then to explore. I traveled. I made sure I left the big cities and went to villages to understand what was going on.
Understood. And the equality or the parity that you talk about, as in the promise of equality or parity that you talk about, I think it's a very complicated promise. Okay, but something that I can sort of see or is visible to people in my industry, which is the comedy industry, is that in when comedy started, right, a few years back in India, it used to be a fairly English market on the web. And the way things have changed in markets across India. Today, it's the Hindi comics the web is Disneyland for a Hindi comic, because our audience is the majority of audience is Hindi. They want their content to be delivered in Hindi. They want experiences that they can relate to, and this parity, or this change could not have been possible, I'm guessing, without the smartphones or the change that you talk about. So my question is, do we see the same? Can we expect a similar change across culture industries in India? And what is the trend going to be?
I think you absolutely can. One of the big trends in the last few years and moving forward is going to be the rise of Indian languages online. And again, in the late 90s, when the internet came to India, every single internet user was also an English speaker. This is similar to when cable TV first came to India in the early 90s, right after the 1991 reforms. Star News was in English, and Star Plus in those days. A lot of the top programs were Western programs. And then it took a couple of years before Hindi programming took off, and then other language programming took off. And now, of course, it's gone in the other direction, where India has more 24-hour channels and more 24-hour news channels than any other country on earth. I think a similar thing will happen with smartphones, because the early internet era in India was an English era. And now that a second wave, a third wave of Indians are getting access to the internet, they're accessing it in the language they are comfortable with. And now companies, both Indian and global, are rushing to create content that these Indian language speakers can consume. So even, say, a Netflix, for example, will make a Sacred Games that has English or even Marathi in it. And there's an audience that really is hungry for native language content. This is long delayed. I think it's only going to continue. And it'll continue in a range of ways that we haven't fully begun to imagine. Every product you can think of, Amazon is now in Hindi. It won't be long before dating apps and all kinds of other products will exist in every vernacular language. And really, why shouldn't it?
Understood. Um, you talked about Simran and you talked about Tinder, right? Something which is very close to my heart, guys. Okay. But to be honest, I grew up in a small town 10 years back. Okay, I grew up before the smartphone or the internet era, and hence I've lived a different life. So my friction when I come and I encounter the big city is different. When I go back home, though, now, in a Lucknow or in a Amethi, I see that my younger cousins are, they have a very different life. Okay, so even though a Tinder might not have come to a really small town, but they do interact with the men, using WhatsApp, using Facebook, using Instagram. The culture has changed a lot when it comes to young people and their dating lives. On the other hand, as you mentioned in the book as well, right, the society around them is it's not catching up in the same way when it comes to romance, or the way people get married. So where do you see this going?
So, as I mentioned as well, there's no guarantee that technology will make India more westernized. I think we'll find desi ways to use these things. And one of the things that both Tinder and Truly Madly's executives told me while I was writing the book is that users are so ashamed or shy of talking about it, they won't even tell their best friend that they're using Tinder and Truly Madly to find a date. There's a stigma attached to it, and I don't know how long it'll take for that stigma to go away. But at the same time, I also saw some very interesting trends. A lot of users of Truly Madly were girls from small town India who saw Truly Madly as a vehicle to leave small towns and to get to Delhi, to get to Bombay. So let's say they would come here for university. This was their way to dream of, of finding a friend circle or a group. And I don't know if your experience was like that, but it is an enabler in that sense. It may reinforce some of our core systems and beliefs rather than changing it.
Understood. And yeah, I think to some extent, I think when I moved from a small town to Delhi for the first time, I think there was no Truly Madly or Tinder at that time. But
But if you used, say, Shadi.com or Bharat Matrimony, the question is, would you have searched by caste or community?
um, not right now.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe you wouldn't have, but I think a lot of Indians would be likely to do that
True,
because
true,
it's something that remains important to them.
true, true, true. Yes, I can understand. True. Another question that I had while reading the book was, we talk about nomophobia, which is, you guys are aware of nomophobia? What is nomophobia? Yeah, it's the fear of not being near your smartphone. Yeah, there's a term for it because it's so common.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
comes from no mobile
Phobia.
phobia, no more phobia.
That's simple. So we talk about nomophobia, and for somebody like me, it sounds like a very a very urban intuitively a very urban phenomena. Okay, and I sometimes see my mother who's been introduced to internet through smartphone recently, and the kind of addiction she has to her smartphone is yeah, yeah, it's happening at your homes also. Yeah, she's far more with her smartphone on WhatsApp, on Facebook all the time. I spend far less time than she does. And I want to understand that is it true that this is probably happening in again as small towns or villages a lot more, that people are actually hooked to their smartphones more than somebody like me or these guys would be.
I mean, the truth is we don't have good data on this, but if one had to guess, and I spoke to some experts, psychologists and internet addiction experts, and they said they really have begun to see a spurt in rural users who are addicted, clinically addicted to their smartphones. And, so for example, there are lots of cases of young boys who come to the city to go to boarding school or to work, and the cities have faster data, and so they get hooked to that, and they get hooked to a certain lifestyle and using the phone in a certain way. And when they have to go back home, they struggle not being connected to the internet in the same way. And really, this could be the beginning of a major health crisis in India. And it doesn't get talked about enough. But there's now an increasing amount of data from the US. There's this wonderful book called iGen, which is written by an American psychologist. And her research suggests that young Americans, so American teens who were born after the age of 2000, so not Gen X, not Gen Y, but Gen Z as they call it in America, or iGen as she calls it, they're just completely different because they are smartphone natives. They've never known the PC era. They just don't think the way you or I may have thought growing up. So when I was young, I aspired to drive, right? I mean, I wanted to get a car, I wanted to get a driver's license. The young American teen today doesn't care about that because they know that they have Uber and Lyft. As a consequence, they also don't really leave home as much. So 20 years ago, the American teenager would go to the shopping mall or go to the playground, or you want to meet people, you want to play sports. They don't need to do that today because they're connected in their pajamas in bed. They can speak to their friends, they can Instagram, they can tweet, they can FaceTime and do whatever it is they do. And what we know is it's not only changing the nature of their generation, but it's having a severe range of ramifications, from increased incidences of depression, increased incidences of suicide. Um, Screen addictions lead to irritability, it leads to a feeling of alienation. This is a real danger, a modern danger in America that doctors are beginning to diagnose and talk about quite openly. I don't think in India we've really started addressing this to the same degree, not in urban India and definitely not in rural India. And so, even as this transformative device reaches everyone's hands and we're so excited about it and it's this great equalizer, we do need to be, as a society, quite worried about what it means. When you have a phone, can you just give it to a 5-year-old to play with? Is there an age restriction? Should we teach them how to use it? Are there adult filters we can put on it? There are a range of questions we need to ask ourselves, and we're not really doing that.
Understood. A related question to that would be, as you mentioned, right, that there is so much that the young people across India are using their smartphones for. Like, there's so much that we are selling to them. on smartphones, right? There's entertainment, there is shopping, there is dating, right? But one of personal struggles that I've faced is that the kind of opportunities that should be there ideally in small town India, job opportunities, or opportunities for education, or educated youth to come back and set up shop in small town India. uh, it could be a personal bias, but my personal experience says that it has not grown in the same trajectory. The way demands, or or the way there's e-commerce, there is Uber, the things that are getting sold to people. But how do we enable those people? How do we get TCS or Infosys or any other MNC to come there and generate jobs over there and create an ecosystem over there? Smartphone could be a great device to probably do that, but I don't see it happening in the same proportion. So do you think we are lacking somewhere there, or is it just something
Yeah, I think, and the trends India is going through are similar to what many developing countries are going through. And so, on the one hand, you have smartphones and internet as this giant tsunami of a force. There are other forces in India at play. One is urbanization. So I remember growing up, India was 75% rural and 25% urban, which is an unnatural proportion. If you look at developed economies, they tend to urbanize because people tend to move to the cities to find jobs. This is quite natural. It's happening in India. It will keep happening in India because as any economy becomes more mature, people move away from agriculture and they move to larger industrial economies or to digital economies now, as the case may be. So they need to move to the cities. That's something that has been happening, will happen, will continue to happen. The other big trend slash force in India is the youth bulge, or as many economists like to say, the demographic dividend. And no other country on earth has as many young people as India does. There are 300 million Indians who are under the age of 14, right? That's the population of America. So India's population today is 1.3 billion or so, 1.33. By 2026, 27, India will overtake China. By 2050, India will cross 1.5 billion. By 2080, India will peak and hit about 1.8 billion people, which is unprecedented. No country has ever come close to this, right? And so, as you have this giant bulge of people, this big population boom, where are they going to go? They're going to go to the big cities. So, here in Mumbai, you will have many new neighbors in the next 20, 30 years to look forward to. Um, and this is where the jobs are going to be created. I think the smartphone, to come back to that, could change some of these things. It might become easier for people to work remotely from villages. A lot of that depends on connectivity. But I think net net, you can't stop what young people have always wanted to do, which is to be in the thick of it. And young Indians are dreamers. They have big aspirations, big hopes. They want to do well. They believe that the earth is theirs. They're coming to Bombay.
very true? Okay, my last question before I open it for the audience is that again, coming back to what I do right now, right? We do comedy and we put our content online, and what we see in again the last 2 years, that the magnitude of trolling or hate that we see on the content has amplified. And okay, there is a certain hate when you put a neutral content out there, but it definitely amplifies a lot more when you put out a political statement or something that that hits some nerves. So again, is that something that's unique to the situation we are living in India and the way we are using smartphone, or again, is that a trend that is you know
I think it's a fairly global trend. I mean, India may have a more exacerbated problem because of the funding for these trolls, and there's a lot of research and several good books written about trolling in India and how certain political parties have digital armies that specialize in targeting people from the opposing parties. There's a lot of literature and research on that, and in a sense, as India digitizes and gets online, it's been very quick to use social media as a weapon of mass destruction. But this is not unique to India. If you look at the spread of fake news in England leading up to Brexit, you look at the US elections and the highly targeted way that we now know that Russian hackers, using very popular social media networks, were able to isolate certain swing voters in certain states and target them with ads that were denigrating Hillary Clinton to try and allow Donald Trump to win. This is fact. I mean, we now know it to be true that this is what they were trying. Whether that led to swinging the outcome of the election, I don't know, but it is very clear that it impacted it. It is very clear that attempts were made. And so um, this is happening all over the world. More trolling, more fake news, more surveillance. What China has going on right now is deeply troubling. Its ability to completely surveil every single person in their country. And it's a technology that they're now exporting to the likes of Zimbabwe and Ecuador and countries that are very grateful to receive this technology because, a lot of authoritarian leaders want to be able to surveil. And this is, again, something that we need to worry about in India. These problems aren't exclusively Indian, but I would say that India is still behind the curve on development. And so it is less likely to have calamities before the West. And so it really should learn from the West's mistakes faster than it currently is.
Understood. Nice. So that brings me to the end of my questions. And thank you so much, Ravi, for answering my questions. Now what we'll do is we'll open the Q&A to the audience. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Ravi. So actually, I am from Kashmir, so that is the question is related with Kashmir. So you told that in Kashmir there is the internet ban and the net is shut down. Have you done somehow a research there that what is the process for that? How what process they follow?
We know there are shutdowns. How do you do it? Is there a big red button? No, there isn't. Basically, day by day, if there's a small encounter in a small part of Kashmir, the Indian state and the police now have the ability to make a call to the ISPs, which is landlines, and to the mobile providers, so Airtel, Jio, all of these companies. And they're able to say very precisely that in this particular area, 1 kilometer radius or less, shut down the internet. And it shuts it down. The person who makes that call can be a police inspector. It doesn't have to be a magistrate. It doesn't have to go through a governor or a chief minister. So it's very easy to shut down the internet in India. And the system is so quick and easy that it happens within minutes. Technically, there's a government circular that's supposed to go out. It goes out the next day. The phone call is what happens first. And it's scary that this happens so often that they all know each other very well. So it's very easy for it to happen, and it is crippling for businessmen, for students, for average citizens.
Okay, so to use your analogy of the car being the smartphone, I would say that data is the oil that makes the car run. What is your opinion on the rise of data oligarchs in India, the people who control the data that make up our entire preferences as a user profile that's just being sold on the open market?
There are increasing signs that this government is quite interested in having access to people's data. There are companies that have access to people's data. And I have to say, though, that while this is a big worry, I'm quite confident and cautiously optimistic about the Indian story. And the reason is that you'll remember how India had a big fight to save net neutrality in India, led by a whole range of activists, including Nikhil Pahwa, who founded SaveTheInternet.in, which is in my book. India also was able to fight back Facebook's Free Basics initiative, thereby protecting net neutrality. Even America hasn't been able to protect net neutrality. So India's had victories. The Supreme Court of India was able to enshrine privacy as a fundamental right. There are many countries in the world that have not been able to do that. So even though today's judgment in the Supreme Court, for those of you who don't know, the Supreme Court ruled 4-1 in favor of allowing Aadhaar to be constitutional. However, a few things like the linking of banks with mobile accounts, banks with Aadhaar number will not be allowed. So private companies won't have access. Um, I know that that decision did not go the way many Indian activists wanted it to go. But at the same time, I can tell you that this debate is vigorous, it is vibrant, and it is wonderful to see that Indian civil society has fought this fight as valiantly as it has. And they may be able to overturn that judgment in a few years, you never know. But the debate here, I have to say now, as an outsider watching in, is very heartening.